Okay, that's fine. So yeah, so in my 6 years, I have learned quite a bit about cybersecurity. But what I have discovered, as Sonali said in the intro about everything changing, um, if you know anything about the company that I work for, you'll have noticed that we've acquired lots of different companies and lots of different technologies in the last few years. So we've expanded from standard VM into OT, into AD, into attack pass. So yeah, it's always changing. I'm always learning. And now even as a manager, it's still important to keep on top of all of the technical side of things too. So today you'll notice that I pronounce it Norsk Hydro because that's how they pronounce it in Norway, even though all week I have been calling it Norsk Hydro, as we would pronounce it here, but Hydro there, so just to get it right. So firstly, who are they? So Norsk Hydro are an aluminium. The particular one that was exposed is an aluminium manufacturing country that are a company that's based in Oslo in Norway. They have their HQ is based in Oslo. They've got 160 different sites that are across 40 different countries and 35,000 employees. So this is not a small setup. When we're talking about OT, we're talking about big manufacturing units. And as you can imagine, with something like aluminium, we're not talking tin foil that you have at home. We're talking about the big building supplies and product manufacturing, and then from there. A little bit of curious information on Norsk Hydro is that their CEO is a woman, Hilda Merete Asheim, and she was one of Fortune's most powerful women the same year that this attack occurred, which is a really interesting to see somebody move to the forefront of the media at a time when it could have gone in the other direction. This particular attack that happened cost them 71 million with time lost while they were down and rebuilding everything from scratch. And out of that, it's also interesting to note with cyber attack insurance that they got 3.5 million back through insurance, which definitely took my breath away because, people would assume that they'd have everything covered under that. But it can show you the difference between the impact and such. When I get into the details of the actual technical side of it, you'll be interested to see how not complicated the attack was, how simple the actual technology was that was used. So, what happened? It was very simple. So the attack came via a phishing email. The phishing email came from a customer address that they're familiar with, something that looks perfectly normal. There was nothing unusual about it. And via that email, then there was some ransomware uh, attached to it that then, through the technology that I'll talk about in a minute, it was pushed across their network and everything was encrypted and shut down from there. It took them 3 solid months from the point that they identified that they had been attacked to get everything back up and running as it was before. Now, in OT, generally the biggest costs are around the actual manufacturing side of things, whether they're providing water supplies to the public or whether they're manufacturing cars. If all of that goes down, even for the space of a few minutes, it can have significant impact. When you look at the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened there recently, and it was in all over the media. Whilst that attack didn't last very long, it affected the fuel prices. They shot up. There was a fuel shortage. There was a big impact on the global fuel supplies because of that particular attack. So it can get very significant very, very, very quickly when you talk about OT attacks. What Norsk Hydro did was they immediately shut down all systems. And that just, it blows my mind, the idea that anybody could do that. Even in my house, when the internet goes down, there's pure panic. Something's not working. Even my heating is connected to the internet, and I have to remember how to go and turn it all on manually in order to turn the radiators on. So when I think about it, a huge manufacturing industry like that, shutting down every single computer in the company, um, it makes me realize the true impact. $71 million means nothing to me. I don't think I'll ever have $71 million or could imagine spending that anywhere for anything. But the idea of having no technology anywhere around me and trying to figure out how to do a lot of things manually, that means something to me. If you've ever had a power cut and you turn around to boil the kettle, it's automatic. You just go and do it and you realize, oh, I can't do that because I don't have power. So the same idea then from there. What they did when they shut down their services. So they had to go back to manual processes. And whilst anyone who had worked on the shop floor, as they would call it, may have learned how to use the machines manually, um, they obviously weren't doing it all the time. So it took a little bit longer to sort of refresh themselves, get familiar with it, and learn to do that. Also, if you have computers um, that are instructing these machines and are doing everything to within, you know, to exacts, I guess. You then switch it over to a human. There's nothing exact about anything that a human does. So it takes a little bit longer to get things right, and then quality control and so on from there. The very first challenge that they had, I was listening to an interview with the CIO at Web Summit after it, and he said the very first challenge they had was that 6 days after the attack was identified. So the attack happened, and it was about 2 or 3 weeks later when they realized that they had been exposed. 6 days after that, then they had to pay. The very first payroll run had to be done in Brazil, I think he said it was. And you've no computers. So you've no idea who you're supposed to pay, how much you're supposed to pay them, what kind of hours they've done, all of their bank details and things like that. So that's the first challenge they were faced with. So for them, it's thinking outside of the box, having to use, I guess, use our brains for things that we would automatically allow our computers to do. So what they did was they essentially got in touch with their banks and said, just copy paste what you did last month, just pay everybody the same as you did before. Humans still have to pay their bills, feed their families, and so on from there. We can't not pay our team, especially when we don't know how much longer it's going to take us to get these things up and running. Made a few adjustments for people that had left and people that had started, but got those human side of things done first. And one of the things you'll notice about if you Google Norsk Hydro or go to YouTube to their channel, you'll see a lot of videos around this. Is they refer to a lot of their team as the Hydro Heroes, because everybody, it was an all hands on deck experience where everybody got in and everybody did jobs that weren't necessarily their jobs in order to get the company back up and running and the manufacturing back in place. They were faced as well with the challenge of, how do we contact everybody? How do we tell everybody not to turn on the computer? We've 35,000 employees. We have them across 40 countries, and we don't even have phone numbers for all these people because the phone numbers are on their HR system and now they don't have access to their HR system. So how do we get in touch with everybody to let them know? So they reached out across Facebook. Wouldn't have been my first port of call, but they reached out literally to anywhere that they could. So they got in touch with as many people as they could on Facebook through means that were external to their network. They also used any WhatsApp groups that they had that were accessible to them to get in touch with everybody. And then in all of the different sites, they had them print or write up signs and stick them near every computer in the company, basically saying, do not turn on your PC. Do not connect to the network. And if anyone that's working from home, if they're connected to the network, to disconnect from the network. Really old school, but really effective. It meant that nobody did get connected, and they all then, once they were, in work or connected to work, that they got in touch to find out what to do next then from there. So when they went back to doing manual processes, we saw things like the people who would have worked in sales who now can do nothing because all of that's driven through their technology and their laptops. We're now working on shop floors, helping to reorganize stock and to do anything they can on the manufacturing side of things. They had a full stock mapping system that had mapped 6,500 stock items across 4,000 shelves. Do your math. That's not going to be a little job to fix that. What they had to do then was to take all of their team and manually restock every item on that shelf on those shelves, so that they could get all of that stock out to any orders that they had access to as quickly as possible. And then they tried to retrieve any other orders through physical means, anything that came in that had been printed that was anywhere else around the company, then to pull all of that together. For something that would normally have taken them a minute to do, so they process a shipment, they print out the order, get everything off of the shelves through automation and out for shipment. It only takes a minute to process the needs to be able to identify where everything is. It was taking them up to 3 to 4 hours to do that. So over the initial stages, a lot of their employees then worked, evenings, weekends, whatever they did in order to get it up and running. And while all of those employees were doing their bit to keep the business turning over, the IT teams then were taking every machine that they could off the network, rebuilding, replacing, restoring, doing anything they could to get everything up and running. Because the bottom line for Norsk Hydro was they were not paying ransomware. They were not going to pay any ransom for anything. And that's a tough decision to make when you know that you're going to lose a significant amount of money. And we've seen it here. We've had the HSE in Ireland was uh, held to ransom for something similar there last year. But it's interesting to see that that was their immediate response is we are not going to pay the ransom and we are going to be 100% transparent about how we do this, about how we get back up and running, and we're going to invite people in so that we can communicate that with the general public, not just the people that are employed by them, but also to the general public, to the customers, to other industries, and basically set a standard on how they're going to do this. Um, and that's brave. I mean, there's going to be companies somewhere that have had some sort of exposure that we've never heard of. You know, not everybody is honest and comes forward and says what's happened. They should, and transparency is key. And Norsk Hydro have shown people that transparency is key. So the CIO of the company, one of the quotes that he said at Web Summit was that he felt that prevention is overrated and that incident response is underrated. Now, if you're working in cybersecurity at all, that's the polar opposite to what you're being taught all the way along. And that's key to OT. OT is looking at the safety first when it comes to manufacturing equipment and employees that are in there, and then people security, then beyond that, and then technology security. In a lot of companies in OT industry, there'll be kit that's in there that's manufacturing and has never stopped, that is older than most people that are on this call, even older than I am in some cases. I'm just thinking, yeah, no. So if you have had kit that's been, I don't know about Norsk Hydro, but if you have had kit that hasn't been turned on for 40 years, or turned off, I mean, for 40 years, then it's a big risk to turn it off at this stage to patch something. So you, when it comes to OT, your approach is going to be very different. It's not always going to be patch first, where it would be in an IT environment, then from there. So anyway, for Norsk Hydro, based on that comment from the CIO, he said that some of the big lessons that he had learned are when it comes to OT, is that documentation is key. And he said even in an IT environment, he feels that this is key. Documenting key phone numbers of people, having actual physical documentation with phone numbers of those to contact should there be an event like this ever again. Documenting the processes for certain things, so key processes in manufacturing, like how to manually use certain machines, how to manually find uh, stock and things like that, how to manually process a payroll, you know, knowing your IBANs and your BICs for the company, that kind of stuff. It's sensitive information, but it's still possible to store sensitive information carefully and do it in a physical way. But to have this reactive kit, this incident response kit as such, ready to go in the event that something like this happens. And there were the biggest lessons that they learned on that side. One of the biggest challenges that they had beyond payroll, they said, is that for every day that the attack went on, there was 6,000 invoices not getting paid that they had to pay. And in most companies, you've got 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is, to pay your invoices. And they didn't yet know how long it would take to get everything back up and running. But that's how quickly things were backing up at the other end, that they can't even see these invoices to pay them. They can't get access to their banks to pay them either. So he said stuff like that, to be aware of it, to understand how those things work should the site go down, should something critical like this happen, so that you're able to act quickly, respond quickly, and keep all of the core services running. Business continuity, as we call it. And in my experience, whether it's, you know, with customers or with customers that I've worked with in the past, or even with companies that I've worked with in the past, business continuity is often a concept as opposed to a practice. And having a concept doesn't do anything for you when you are attacked or when you are exposed in some way like that. It's something in the same way that you do fire drills in schools. it's important to actually go through some of these practices with the key people that are involved in it to make sure that everybody is prepared should something like that happen. In the opinion of the CIO, in that case, it's inevitable for many companies that it will happen, and especially in things like OT. You're talking about simpler network attacks that can do it. And with that, then what we'll do is I'll talk to you a little bit about the kind of attack that happened. So Locker Goga is a particular kind of attack, and there's a screenshot of what they would have seen on the screen. Really nice, polite message telling them that everything is encrypted basically, and pay your ransom and we'll give you everything back. And we all know that how that works. You might be lucky, you might pay a ransom, you might get everything back, and that could be the end of it. But also, at that point, they may not have known um, how long the ransomware was in place, whether there was still anything going to be held hostage as such after that. It's risky to do it, so very brave to say you're not going to pay the ransom. The Lockergoga ransomware doesn't self-spread across the internet. It in itself is quite self-contained. So to get that onto the network was the first challenge, and then to spread it across the network was the the biggest challenge then from there. So the attacker got it on the network 2 to 3 weeks before it was discovered, which is a significant amount of time to cause an impact across any network, least of all an OT network. So the malware that was on some of the devices is how they discovered that it was in place. I know one of the guys it could have been the Toulouse site, I'm not sure, was the first to report seeing the pop-up on screen and reported it immediately. That was like 2 a.m. in the morning, reported it immediately to say that there was an issue. What happened is once the ransomware was in on site, they used other tools to push it across the network, got access to the admin credentials. Seemed very simple so far. Then accessed further across the infrastructure, and for every machine that they targeted, then after that encrypted the files that were on it, changed the local admin credentials then from there and made them inaccessible to the Norsk Hydro employees. Nothing super complicated. I would love to say that this was a really sophisticated technical attack, but no. In the case, when it comes to OT, it's often a simpler attack that is at the root of the issue, where the big challenge should be in the OT side of things is getting onto that network. When they're on the network, it's simple technology in many cases, but the challenge should always be that they aren't able to get it onto the network. So Locker Goga has been used in a whole bunch of different attacks. I've just picked this one specifically because of the really heroic response to it. The really ideal, if I could textbook write a perfect response for somebody who had been attacked with regards to their media coverage, their responsibility to their employees, responsibility to their customers, the Norsk Hydro would be the one that I would go with. Obviously, I'm talking about it. But there are lots of others as well. So um, the Locker Goga was used to target, it's primarily used, I guess, to target industrial firms. It seems to be the most effective in that case. And it has been seen across Altron was exposed back in the beginning of 2019 there in France to do automotive, aerospace, manufacturing, things like that. Two chemical companies in the States, Hexion, Momentive, and then there's a whole bunch of other victims, and some of them probably still undisclosed. No doubt there's ones that we don't know about, but it's used a lot. When they can get in, it's really effective. Um, and it makes sense. There's not a lot of effort involved. When somebody is targeting an OT environment, as a general rule, it doesn't make sense to try and take control of the OT equipment because you need specialist knowledge in how to use that equipment. It's not that straightforward. And the most you can do is probably cause damage to whatever's being built in that location, with the exception of the Florida water attack that happened there I think it was last year, where they added significantly more sodium hydroxide into the water, and essentially instead of it being used to clean or purify the water, it was used to poison the water. But it was identified by an individual who spotted that somebody had remoted into the machine and reversed it before it caused any impact to people. So there's two different types. You've manufacturing in OT for monetary or business purposes, and then you've got public supplies of things like water or fuel, gas, whichever from there. But taking charge of the equipment is rarely the goal for the people that attack it. It's more taking charge of the network and restricting access to those who can use those systems then. So Locker Gaga, like I said, it can't spread itself. It focuses on not letting people access their own equipment, right? So their own laptops and so on from there. It's much more effective that way. So it causes this massive financial impact by restriction from there, and then hence ransomware. It's named after a file in its source code, a path file in its source code. First thing it does is get access to credentials, simple means like phishing, like in this case, then through an email. And then it used something like tools like Metasploit or Cobalt Strike then to allow it to move to other computers across the network and get higher level credentials until it gets everything it needs from there. Once it has the high level credentials, then it'll push out, or it'll use AD then to push out the payload to all the other machines on the network that it can, and it'll use things like signed stolen certificates so that it looks more authenticated or more convincing, and nobody picks it up then from there. But before it runs the code, then it sends out a kill command on the antivirus, so antivirus doesn't pick it up, because it's such a simple thing that antivirus should pick it up. If it's up and running, it should pick it up straight away. And then within minutes of accessing the machine, then it encrypts all of the local files. Sometimes they'll disable the network connection, tends to be a little bit more obvious and picked up in that case. But they'll change the password, and sometimes they'll power off the system altogether. And then, of course, the cake is iced with that ransom note that you see on screen there, which is beautiful and nice and polite, but terrifying for whoever gets it on screen, because it's going to be pretty immediate what the impact of that will be. So Norsk, their reaction, I talked about them being transparent, and the more I looked into it, the more videos I watched, the more interviews I watched, the more I read about it, the more I realized that they were not joking about being completely transparent, not one bit. So, like I said before, transparency is shouldn't be unusual, but it has been unusual across all industries when it comes to cyber attack, not specific to OT. And we're seeing more and more companies become much more honest about it. And that's good. That's what we want to see. If I'm purchasing off of a company and they've been exposed in some way, I'd like to know that, how they're reacting to something like that, so that I can trust that company in the future. So what they did is they had daily broadcasts. So every day they sent messages out. I think it was through social media in the very beginning, because that's where the only thing they could access that was safe and not connected to their network. Within a week, they had a website up that was exclusive of their network, where they could communicate completely every day what was happening on that, so that anyone in the public could see it. They had Q&A sessions every day, press releases every day, often several times a day, and it was all run from the HQ in Oslo. They had conferences where they invited people in to those press conferences in the HQ, and they invited journalists in to any of their sites to do a walk around and see what was being done to get everything back up and running from there. And I think that experience taught a lot of not just OT customers, but anyone in cybersecurity about how these things could be dealt with. It's interesting. It's fascinating to watch the whole process. If you get a chance to look at their YouTube channel, do. They're only little short videos, but it's just fascinating to see the human response to it. The Microsoft Dark team, that's a detection and response team, they got involved as well to help them get everything up and running as quickly as possible. Microsoft Security, their cybersecurity team, assisted as well. Part of a learning process from both sides then from there. For them, incident response is just as important as prevention, but like I said, the CIO said even more important than prevention. Prevention can't always be 100% effective. The only way that's going to be 100% effective is if you turn everything off. That's it, simple. And that's not realistic to do. So you always have to anticipate that there will be some sort of exposure. Their key was transparency and frequency. People were at no point going to be wondering what was happening. They wanted to make sure that they communicated constantly with them. And the cyber heroes is what they call them, the Hydro cyber heroes. But the most interesting part I found is that normally if you follow the media and every day there's a cyber attack somewhere against someone, in typically in a traditional IT environment, and their share price, if it's a public company, the share price typically dips. That's fairly normal to see that. People lose a little bit of confidence in the company and their ability to protect whether it's their data or the industry from there. But not with Norsk Hydro. When they reacted to this with such a strong and fierce, defiant reaction, their share price went up. They actually, it was reflected in the market that people had confidence in their ability to do right by their customers, to do right by the industry, and to show hackers, no, we won't be told what's what. So yeah, so this is a story I wanted to tell. I know we're going to have a few questions then afterwards, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about OT. But you can see from this, I'll just pop it onto the Q&A part of it, but you can see from this why I said at the very beginning, when you think about OT and you think about cybersecurity, you still need to be aware of all things cybersecurity, because every OT network has IT on it. You're typically talking about the combination of both. But when you talk about an OT network, the practicalities of shutting things down to patch them, or shutting things down to you know to rebuild or fix or even restore are difficult to do. Like, say, 3 months from start to finish to get all of this up and running. And in most industries, that's simply not practical. Many companies will go bump within 3 months if they couldn't manufacture like that. In the OT industry, there's exceptions to almost every single rule when it comes to cybersecurity, but you still need to know your cybersecurity to understand why the approach is different then from there. Okay. Shall we go to questions?
Yeah. So thanks, Jennifer. I mean, I was super amazed to think $71 million. Oh my God. I could think, I mean, it's not a small amount, and you could do a lot with that amount. And that's true, yes. With IT and OT, we have different cybersecurity practices. And it's pretty scary to hear about like these kind of attacks, and that too when the ransomware attack is involved. So I have few questions related to this. The first one, I think you have already answered a little bit of that, but still I will restate the question. So how do you think an organization can protect their OT environment without risking the or interrupting vital systems?
So because every OT environment now typically has some sort of a connection to an IT environment. Like OT environments traditionally, if you think way back to the industrial age, when everybody worked everything manually, and then we introduced computers, and there was computer-based businesses, and then there was OT-based businesses that were, like, say, manually used. Over time, we combined the two of them, and by the nature of the combination of the two, then we expose the OT network. So when you start running OT equipment using machines that are based on Windows OSs, now you have to be concerned about, patching those Windows OSs, because it's almost always not about them trying to take control of the machine, but trying to restrict access to those machines. So when you want to protect an OT network, you're protecting the entire IoT network, and it's first defenses. So in many cases, on that shop floor where the OT equipment is not the bit that you're concerned about protecting, it's whatever is accessing that network. So you need to look at things like multi-tiered security control, segmented networks, enhanced network segmentation, firewalls, application layer firewalls, isolated networks. And then, of course, even with all of those things in place, you have to have really sound and solid backup and recovery practices, because as the CIO of Norsk Hydro says, it's the reaction that is almost more important in the OT side of things than prevention in this case, because prevention isn't always realistic to implement on an OT site.
True. I agree with that. So do you think that in past couple of years, OT security has gained more popularity? And how do you think that the potential threat vectors towards the OT environment has shifted?
So with the same kind of theme in place, I guess, yes, in the past couple of years, we've seen it in the media more, because it has been an easy target in the past, for the same reason. If you've got combined networks like that, and there's the ability for someone to hack into a Windows machine or a Linux machine on a network that's exposed, and then gain access to OT kit from there, why not? It does seem like a very simple thing to do. And in that case of Norsk Hydro, you see that the attack type was very simple, but the gaining the access to the network is where the challenge should be. So traditional OT machines don't have digital entry points, um, which means they have to get into that IoT environment then from there. And as they increase the ability to combine, to have that IoT environment, then the attack surface increases as well. There's costs there as well, that fascinate people. So like we talk about 71 million losses there in Norsk Hydro. But if you think about a manufacturing plant that has to shut down a machine to patch it, and it costs $1 million for every minute that it's shut down while they patch it. Apart from the anxiety that I would get if I was the person that was patching that system. In many cases, I couldn't imagine it. In many cases, it's simply not practical to do so. If you have kit that is, like, say, 30 years old and it's never been turned off, they're simply not either not going to patch it, or maybe there's not patches that are available for that kind of kit. So we take that step away from there. And because it hasn't been at the forefront of people's mind when it comes to cybersecurity. I think that's why it crept into the news, because as IT cybersecurity practices have improved and gotten better over time, those that are hacking and want to make it, whether it is that they're going to hold things to ransom or they want to just simply do damage, are going to target the easier ones from there. So they've moved on, and that's why we're seeing more about it. It's a lot easier to cause more significant damage if you can get into an OT environment, like the water supply one that I mentioned. That was somebody who accessed it through remote software, something like TeamViewer, where they were able to get into an individual's PC, and that PC had access into the systems for dosing the sodium hydroxide into the water. So it was, again, not a complicated piece of software. In fact, I didn't even really hack it. I just got the passwords for that remote access then from there. But when it comes to the popularity as such, the core practices, the very first day one things that you learn in cybersecurity would still apply, because you're still protecting the IT side of the network. So it's all about education for those that are on the shop floor in these environments, about physical safety, physical security, and doing things like making sure they have multi-factor authentication, that they have strong passwords. Again, having segmented networks restricts the impact to specific parts of the network as opposed to the entire network. There are a whole bunch of different industry standards now that you can follow on the OT side, which give OT environments a nice, clear kind of guideline to follow depending on the environment that you're in. Getting people in to do third-party assessments where possible. And I say where possible because, again, a lot of OT environments don't want anybody actively targeting their network, even if it is for their best interest. But there is the capability, a lot of tools out there now where you can do passive monitoring, where you're um mirroring port traffic and watching what's happening there, so that if there's any change in the traffic on that network, any change in activity, that you can easily identify it and flag it, and then things can be stopped immediately rather than waiting till you pick something up maybe with AV or something like that. So all of those things are getting much more media coverage now, because that was a really long answer to your question. I'm sorry, but in the event, let's say I target a retail site, maybe I steal some money. But if I target an OT site and I cause the fuel price to go up, or I cause a lot of physical damage to machines that cost millions, it's much more interesting. From a hacker perspective, it's a bigger impact that you're making there. And I think that's why we're hearing so much more about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's actually about the impact. I mean, they want to gain more, obviously, from these kind of attacks. So the next question is in line with this, that we have some organizations that equate IT with the control system security. So what are your points on that?
So, and a lot of organizations, you'll see, especially over things like COVID, there's been an increased need for remote access to systems, right? So that's something that they wouldn't have done before, especially in OT environments. But with that, there is more of a need for the two to be combined. There is more of a response, a similar response that needs to be in place with that. Also, you're seeing more of a use of common OSs. So in the beginning, it would have been things like, bespoke sort of Linux OSs, and now you're seeing more like Windows OSs involved in these kind of environments as well. So the security that would be in use would be via the IT systems again then from there, and would be via a simpler setup then from there. But there are, when it comes to IT security and control system security, again, there's frameworks that are in place specifically identifying items that are different or need to be bore in mind in relation to OT and IT environments. So there's like NIST framework, there's NERC, there is CSSP, and there is an IEC. Oh, it's got a number like 62443, I think. So those are all in place, and they're actually quite an interesting read as well. But when it comes to that, my inclination would be to lean heavily into all of those frameworks as opposed to designing your own, because the environments are so unique.
Okay, that's nice. Jennifer, we have some questions from the audience as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that's based on the, I mean, first question is based on the slide that you presented, the story.
Yeah.
So it says like what steps were taken to contain this kind of attack? So there are 3 questions in total. Yeah, this is the first one.
Yeah. So when it came to containing the attack, they were already 2 weeks in, 2 to 3 weeks in. So identifying the level of impact was primary. So the steps that were taken immediately with regards containing it was every single technical host was turned off. Everything, PCs, laptops, payroll machines, network devices, even the original OT devices to begin with, were turned off. So that's how they contained it. And then all IT teams and anyone else that could get involved, it was all hands on deck with regards assessing each machine individually and identifying whether it has been affected by the attack or not. If it has, then it had to be rebuilt. If it hadn't, then it still had to be cleaned down and reconnected as such to the network. So when you talk about an IT environment and containing an attack, you can often lock down sections of your network or run some sort of a scan or assessment across the network to identify what's in place. When you talk about an OT network, scanning is like a dirty word across an OT network. It sounds active, it is active, and nobody wants to do that. Passive is the way to go when it comes to OT networks. So yeah, so containing something like this, they did exactly the right thing. It's old school, shut everything off. I know we had when WannaCry happened, oh my gosh, that was like 2016, 2017. It feels like 100 years ago now. I remember because I was working the weekend when that happened, and we had to call everybody in to get plugins in place and scan templates in place for people to be able to identify it. But I do know that local to me, there was a clinic that did exactly that, shut every machine down because they knew they were impacted by it and were trying to figure out how much of the network was affected, and they shut it all down because they were concerned about medical equipment that may have been impacted by it as well. So OT isn't, we always talk about industry and manufacturing, but when you talk about things like hospitals as well, there's nobody going to scan an MRI machine to see if there's vulnerabilities on it, but they will shut it down in order to assess if it has been impacted by something. Again, it's reactive rather than proactive. Hopefully that helped.
That's right. Okay, so we have another question that from your experience, was there any attack which was prevented just in time, preventing extensive data loss?
When it comes to the OT environment, we never hear about the ones that prevent it from happening, which is kind of sad, really, because I mean, I consider the Norsk reaction uh, a success. While it may not feel like that, and we talk about the big losses, they've taught a lot to the industry, to everyone in OT about how they should react to things. But when somebody gets to something ahead of time and prevents it, generally they don't want people to know that it even happened. So it's not something that they talk about. It's not disclosed. It's just something that they go home themselves thinking, whew, that one was resolved. So I would love to tell lots of stories about near misses, but they just don't make it into the media. They're not nearly as interesting as the ones with the 70 million losses, you know.
Yeah. I mean, the transparent approach that they adopted, it was better, and it's quite informative for others also. It gave
Yeah.
others more information like about these kind of attacks. But yeah, it's daring approach also.
Absolutely.
So,
I can't recommend enough that people check out, like, say, their YouTube channel. They have lots of information about what they do anyway. But when you look specifically at this attack, it's really human, the approach to it. You can easily imagine what it would be like to be the salesperson that's now reorganizing stock on the shop floor, or people that are going, like, there's chaps in their high vis uniforms, but they're going through folders and folders and folders of orders to try and find things. And the camaraderie was fantastic, and it really was a great lesson to be learned.
okay, so we have one more question. This is how did they recover the data for all the affected system? I know, I mean, they had this manual approach, but still, do you want to share some points on this?
So the CIO couldn't stress enough about backup and recovery practices. In their case, they learned, like, for anything that was clean and could be retained on the network, it stayed. But really, for anything, which was almost everything that couldn't, they had to rebuild machines from scratch and restore to backup. In most companies, when you talk about IT infrastructure, the backups are happening pretty often. You're talking about payroll machines and, marketing software and sales software. That stuff tends to be backed up pretty regularly. But what they did learn is that example of the stock control equipment, where they had what did I say, 6,500 stock items on 4,000 shelves. That got lost. That had to be rebuilt from scratch, and because that was impacted, and they couldn't restore a backup for that. If you think about it with stock control systems, it's just not valid anymore. If you've got a backup from last month, the stock is all moved, it's in different places, and there's different volumes of it. So in the case of that, recovering the data for that was a physical exercise. They put people out to go count the stock on the shelves, detail all the stock on the shelves, and manually pull that whole stock process together and identify where all 4,000 items were. And they did that quickly, and then they shipped those items out to anyone whose orders they could fulfill straight away. But yeah, old school stock count in that case. But as far as I know, the rest of it was done through backups and restores.
Okay. So, are there any specific controls that Norse put in the place to prevent the similar attack in future?
So, from what I've learned from the CIO, they had controls in place to prevent it. That's the saddest part, I guess, about the whole story is they had AV in place. They had malware, anti-malware in place as well. They had firewalls and protection, everything that they needed on their network. It was a phishing email, which makes it that even bit harder to I guess to feel like you can react to it, because if the phishing email looked like 90% of phishing emails, people would have identified straight away um that it was indeed phishing. But because it came from an email address from a customer that they already knew and looked legitimate, it wasn't picked up, like, say, and it even took them a while to identify where it came from in the first place. It's If you're good at phishing, I guess, then you're going to sneak things past people like that. And even with the best of training, um, for people on identifying phishing emails, or making sure the door is closed behind you and all those things, there's still a human involved in that process. And the biggest weakness I believe that we have in all things IT security are always going to be the humans. They're going to click something, they're going to leave a door ajar, they're going to do something, and you can prepare as best as possible for that through education. And I think that, like I say, the biggest lesson that they learned, or specific controls we talk about, but the biggest lesson they learned is about the manual documentation of key things that they found that they needed within the first day or two of this happening, like the emergency mobile phones. Actually, they set up emergency groups on Facebook. They said they're empty groups that have people in them. There's no posts, nothing exciting happening in there. But in the event that something like this was to happen again, they could immediately contact everybody who could access their Facebook emergency group via their own personal phones and such, if anything like that ever happened. But they would be able to immediately get in contact with the key people that they needed. And that's what they learned from that. They learned the benefit, I guess, of social media. That's how they managed to get in contact with everybody straight away. So, but what works for Norsk Hydro may not work for the next OT environment. They are so unique in that way. I mean, it's quite easy to read requirements or specifications, best practices when it comes to IT environments and cybersecurity. A lot of it can be documented, and this is how you should do things. when you talk about OT environments, again, like even when you compare a manufacturer who makes something for commercial use versus a public service provider who provides water to people, the reactions are going to be very, very different. You know, I couldn't even fathom in the case of that the Florida water supply attack, if that had have gotten through, if it hadn't have been picked up by somebody who happened to sit in front of the computer at the time, what would they have done? Like, how do you undo something like that? So it will be very different from site to site. In their case, they said that they invest that little bit more time into reactive processes and manually documenting these kind of things.
Yeah. So as you mentioned that they already have like a lot of preventive measures in place, like firewalls, vulnerability scanners, or AVs. But I mean, in OT security, unlike IT security, we have PLCs, right? Sensors, or we have industrial gateways that do not have a secure credential, like digital certificates or private keys hidden in a silicon as the basis of trust. So how do we add a protection layer there?
So with the newer OT equipment, they've started now getting password protected PLCs, which is good. That's finally good to see those things happening. But yeah, on the older equipment, it wasn't in place. But what you'll know in a lot of OT environments is that some of these kits come with, I say kits like it's a small thing. I'm imagining big transformer like equipment really. But they come with additional login features and additional safety features that are and security features that are not turned on by default, that have to be, and often through a very complicated process, have to be manually enabled by the individuals that are using that equipment, or installing, maintaining that equipment. So that's a good place to start, is to turn on that. Like, having additional login is going to tell you so much more about unusual activity on certain kit. And then, having the additional security practices in place may make it slightly more difficult to carry out the process of using that kit or manufacturing whatever it is that you want to do, but it's going to be beneficial should there be any kind of an attack in place. There's other things that they can do that are much more, I guess, traditional when you're talking about the IoT network. So, routing traffic through whitelists and using exclusive whitelists. Port monitoring is a massive one because that can be done passively without, impacting any of the kit that might be on the OT network. Really obvious ones like having anti-malware software and antivirus software, and checking that software often to make sure it is in fact still running. It hasn't been shut down, doing random checks on those kind of things. And then the damage limitation is often the only thing that you can do on the OT side. So to put practices in place to try and limit the impact versus to try and prevent it completely, they often won't be able to prevent it completely. So that's things like I mentioned earlier, like the segmented networks, and like say the firewalls and things like that. You're going back out to protecting from the IT side of it so that nobody can ever get access into the OT side of it. So you work with whatever you can in that case, and you can't put many of those practices in place on 1986 OT kit, so you have to get ahead of it and do it and stop them from getting it even anywhere near that.
Yeah. So now I think I have the last question, which is the most basic and relatable question for everyone. So where do you think an individual can start their OT journey? I mean, do you recommend some certifications, some courses to start it with?
Well, yeah, anyone who works in cybersecurity, it's always a good place to start because you need to know what you know before you know what you don't know, if that makes sense. And if you understand uh, best practices around cybersecurity, and then, like I said in the beginning, and then forget it all. No, you need to understand all that because that's still going to be needed to protect an OT environment, one step away or one layer away from there. But that said, if you're going to move into OT security, it's really vital that you get the opportunity to be in an OT environment, to walk around a plant, to get an actual physical sense of how these things work. What I learned and bear in mind that we don't spend a lot of time on OT sites, but we will talk to customers who have OT sites, and we have to be very, very cautious about the kind of language that we use. So like I said earlier, we would never say, oh, you should scan that environment or scan that host. it's an immediate no-no in an OT environment to talk about doing anything active like that. So we always move towards passive. We always move towards it's lower key uh, protection and trust as such from there. It's low impact. Anything that doesn't interrupt manufacturing services, doesn't interrupt their OT hosts. And it took me a long time to just get my head around even thinking that way. And it's simple things like safety is first in an OT environment, and then, like I say, the actual people security is such, what, not allowing people that shouldn't be on that site anyone that can come in and pull plugs. But safety is key always in OT environments. So how many IT sites do you go onto where you'd have to wear a high vis jacket and a hard hat? And that's important. Even if you're just the techie who's on that site, you need to be aware of all of the safety practices. You need to not touch things unless you know exactly the impact of doing so. It's a whole different mentality. So whilst there's a benefit and it's really important to have all of the cybersecurity side of things, if you're going to go into OT security, you have to try and get exposure to those kind of sites, even like say if it's walking around it. What I would find with most people that I see that end up on the OT security side of things, and it's relatively new even in there, are people who would be working in that industry first and foremost, and then they become the OT security people, if that makes sense, as opposed to starting in cybersecurity and then going into OT. So there are people who are well used to being on factory floors and being, in environments where all of these huge machinery is in place, or the understanding of the cost of maintaining and patching things is really, really clear.
Okay, so okay, this will be the last one now, Jennifer. I think we have last minute question. And this is quite interesting. So most of the water treatment plants are moving to technologies which allow remote access and etc. So it's crazy to see how it can be hacked in. But the problem is that most of these public utilities do not have enough budgets to keep their cyber infrastructure updated. So, I mean, what do you think? I mean, what can be done?
That's an interesting one, and it is in fact very, very true. Especially when you talk about government bodies, it's amazing how there is a lack of funding for these things. Even in as little as maybe 3 or 5 years ago, there was no OT security interest, let alone a budget for that kind of thing. Um, what tends to happen in a lot of those sites is they keep everything they can on-prem. There is no internet connection for anything. And only more recently, like you say, with something like COVID, it's meant that people have had to have remote access in sites where machines can be controlled, but they have to restrict the number of people that are on that site. And that has come with risk, and that has come with what do you call it, like emergency budgeting for that kind of thing. But yeah, you're right, especially when it comes to water supplies, gas supplies. In the manufacturing industry, when it's a commercial thing, that a business where they're making money from selling things, there's more likelihood of an emergency budget for those things. But when you talk about things that are government funded, and the governments have taken quite a hit, and with COVID, with regards just maintaining people, keeping them alive and well, and funding them and making sure everybody's fed, shall we say. There's less of a budget for these kind of things. But what they do primarily is keep everything as on-prem as possible. So you're talking about physical security, then ensuring that, that you have locked doors and locked windows. I know that sounds kind of daft, but it's true. But as they move to remote access, then it has to be done with a cyber security budget in place. It simply has to be. It's irresponsible to the public to not. And we are seeing more and more of that in the conversations I know that I'm having. We're seeing more and more of those industries starting to lean into it, which is good. It's good. It's good to hear.
Yep. Okay, I think that's all for the question session, and we are quite on time as well. So thanks Jennifer for this informative session. We have a lot of feedbacks as well. People are thanking you, and it's quite eye-opener for them as well. And they were very interested. I mean, they were very excited to hear this North story. So yeah, thank you so much for the session.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining in. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the amazing session. Thank
You're
you,
very
Sonali.
welcome.
Thank you.